Forgot to start the recording, so oh well. Those at home or who are watching this after the fact, they'll just have missed the prayer. That's okay. All right, so let's do just a very quick recap. If you remember, last time we met, we were in chapter 16, and we talked a lot about the bowls of wrath that were being poured out. We made a lot of connections to those plagues that were being poured out on the earth, and the ones that were in Egypt as well. So there's a lot of similarities there. Yeah, exactly. In the book of Exodus. So some similarities there that are worth noting, I suppose. And one of the other interesting things about chapter 16 is all these judgments are being poured out, and they're pretty terrible. Water being turned to blood, people being covered in boils, things like that. But as we see here in verse 5, the people, the angels and those who are in heaven are watching all this going on, saying, yeah, this is right. They're getting what they deserve. It's righteous judgment by God. There's no question about that, even though it seems harsh maybe to us. So so 16 again was mostly the bowls of wrath. Now these next two chapters we're going to be looking at. We talked a little about the frog-like creatures and all that stuff. Okay. These next two chapters that we're going to be looking at are going to be looking at this event, this judgment of Babylon. And I wanted to try to get through both of them in one night, but we tried last night, it didn't work. So we'll probably just get through 17 tonight and come back to 18 tomorrow. And I'll try not to get too ahead of myself, but inevitably I'm probably going to. So just bear with me a little bit. We'll talk about Babylon and this coming judgment on Babylon and what this means and all that stuff. So it'll take a couple of sessions, but we'll get there. But let's just jump into chapter 17 and we'll start there. So then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. So, okay, this beast we should all pretty much recognize at this point. We've talked about it over and over and over and over again because it keeps showing up over and over and over and over again in this book. And again, this is, this final world empire, the final world leader, Satan, who's behind it. They're all kind of represented by this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And it's interesting because this woman is basically riding this beast. This is what biblical scholars call the woman who rides the beast. I think there's a book by Dave Hunt that's actually called that, The Woman Who Rides the Beast. So, and I'll be kind of drawing from some of his research, I guess you'd call it, tonight a little bit. We'll talk about it. But yeah, so there's this system, and then there's this woman. Again, these are symbolic of things. John is literally seeing these things, but again, they represent different things, and we'll talk about that's kind of the main question. What does this woman represent exactly? And I'll, again, give you my best conjectures, and you guys can kind of come to your own conclusions. But a couple of things that we see here. One, it says that she is, in verse 7, seated on many waters. So the idea of water, and this will become explicitly stated later in this chapter. These waters are basically nations, groups of people. Anytime we see idioms of waters, it's what it represents: people groups, large people groups in general. So usually nations, things like that. And it says that she has committed sexual immorality with the kings of the earth. And sexual immorality, again, in the Bible, idiomatically more or less symbolizes sin, but more specifically, idol worship. Anytime that Israel is accused of being sexually immoral as a nation, it's because that they are worshiping other idols and giving themselves over to other gods and things like that. So that's kind of the idea here. And as we talked about, we tend to think of idols as just like little statues or something like that. But as we've stated in previous sessions, those statues are representative of realistic spiritual forces, more or less. Okay. So not all of them, obviously. Some of them were just little idols that people were like, superstitious about, but not all of them, I would say. Some of them definitely had some spiritual powers behind them. And again, that's kind of why it's referred to as sexual morality. It's like, having like a spiritual connection with something other than God, that's why it's kind of put in those terms of like adultery and things like that. So furthermore,
is homosexuality considered sexual immorality?
Well, committing homosexual acts would be considered, sexual immorality.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Like just simply being a homosexual, okay, like having that disposition in and of itself is not necessarily sinful any more than, my heterosexuality is, because, it's not your inclination that's the problem. It's what you do with that, right? Where your mind goes and where your actions go. That's where it becomes a problem. So I want to make that kind of clear, because I think that historically the church has done a bad job. I think in the modern age, I think it's kind of come around to the truth of the matter. But like simply having those tendencies is not where it's a problem. You know what I mean? Because
I think there's some people that are. So they're not. If they act on it, that's sinful. Being the way they are, it's not sinful then.
Right, because in me is like, so I'm married, okay, and in me is a person, or in my flesh, there's this desire for women other than my wife, right? And so like, okay, what do we do with that exactly? Well, the answer is, well, I don't give into it. You know what I mean? Like I don't give over to your mind or your body, right? And so so simply having that desire, that nature, right? Like that's not necessarily sin, because this is the thing. I think Jesus had that nature too. He was a man, you know what I mean? It says that he was tempted in every way that we are tempted. Okay, so he too had those inclinations because he took on flesh.
So
however, he didn't.
Woman and still had feelings.
Probably, I think so. Yeah, I would say he probably did. But the thing is, he never acted on them. He never sinned. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the difference. I've heard it said this way, like, hey, you can't stop a bird from flying over your head, but you can stop it from making a nest in your hair. It's kind of like that. You know what I mean? Like, listen, you get weird thoughts and, and stuff like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It's what you do with it after that.
Jesus could have been like, oh, that's a beautiful girl.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something, it's a good question, but so anyway, people say that, oh, Christians are, they hate gay people. No, we don't. Like, you shouldn't hate anybody. You know what I mean? Like, we're taught to love people. But that doesn't mean that right and wrong change. You know what I mean? Like, God has set up the world in a certain way, and there's right and there's wrong. And it's like, hey, listen, you don't have to obey God if you don't want to, but you can fight God if you want, but you're not going to win. And it turns out that his opinion is the only one that really matters anyway. So, so there's that. But anyway, coming back to Revelation 17. So 17:2, it also says that these kings have drunk of this wine, right? And then they're drunk on it. Wine again usually represents blood. So even Jesus highlights that in the Lord's Supper, right? So take this wine, represents my blood. So
it's okay to drink, it's just not okay to get drunk.
Yeah, but this is idiomatic. I think that what this is talking about more violence. I don't think that this is literal wine, although they probably are drinking alcohol as well. I'm not saying they're not, but I think with the idiom that's being used here is that the kings of the earth have entered into this violence, that this great prostitute is kind of leading them in as well. So we'll see. More of this will get fleshed out again in this chapter and the next chapter. So bear with it, and we'll get through it all. But moving on, 17:4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. So, okay, let's stop here for a second. So this is going to give us some more clues in terms of, okay, who is this great prostitute? What's her deal? Where's she from? All that stuff. So one of the first things that we see is that she's arrayed in purple and scarlet. Now, Why is that interesting to me? And I'm gonna say this. I'll just start with the conclusion, sort of, or one of the leading conjectures, I would say, about who this woman is, and then we'll kind of fill it out as we move along. So again, if I've never actually read the book, but I've seen I've seen
purple is the color of royalty, right?
Purple was a color of royalty, yeah. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you've ever read Dave Hunt's book, Woman Rides the Beast, he basically lays out the claim that the Catholic Church is the great prostitute. Now, I think it might be a little more complicated than that. The two main conjectures I would probably lean on are this woman is either Islam, like as we know it today, it's the Catholic Church, or it's a conglomeration of all of these things. Okay, we don't really know, because I think one of the key things here is that it says here in verse 5 that it's a mystery. The idea of a mystery in the Bible, it's like we usually think of a mystery almost as a puzzle. Like, okay, the pieces are there, we just kind of have to put it together and solve it, right? That's not the case with the Bible. When it talks about a mystery, it's something that's hidden, something that has not yet been revealed. The church was one of the great mysteries that Paul talks about in his writings, because there were kinds of hints of it in the Old Testament, but there wasn't enough for anybody to really understand like what the church was, that God would literally dwell inside of people, that people would be filled with the Holy Spirit. That was something that totally blew his mind. He didn't see that coming at all. It was a mystery. It was something that was hidden and it was revealed. So I think one of the things about this woman, this great prostitute, Babylon, as she's called, it is a mystery. It's something that's been hidden. I don't think that it's been completely revealed yet. I'll again, as usual, I'll tell you kind of where I lean and why. But anyway, just so that's kind of the conclusion, I guess. Now I'll start evaluating some of these verses and seeing why I kind of lean that way. So the first thing is that this woman is arrayed in purple and scarlet. Now, where do we see purple and scarlet being demonstrated? Well, a couple of places. So in the book of Matthew 27, this is right before Jesus is crucified. It says in Matthew 27:27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's quarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him, and they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand, and kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So in this scene, we see that Jesus, before this is like the next thing that happens in this passage is Jesus is crucified. This is the last thing that happens to him, where these soldiers are just, toying with him basically. And this is where they put the crown of thorns and they put this scarlet robe on him. Okay. Now, Mark and John both give similar accounts, but you'll notice there's a key difference here. So in Mark 15:16 says, and the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then John writes, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe, and came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. So a lot of Bible critics will look at these passages and say, aha, this is the same instance, but look, in this one book, it says that he's wearing scarlet, and the other one's saying that he's wearing purple. It's a discrepancy. See, the Bible can't even get its story straight, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so a number of people have tried to counter that point here by saying, well, maybe the shade of robe that they're using was somewhere between purple and scarlet. Like, maybe in a certain light it looks more purple, maybe in another light it looks more scarlet, blah, 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 maybe. Scarlet's red, yeah, it's a reddish color, basically, very red. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true either. I've never found that to be super intellectually satisfying, I suppose. So one of the things I kind of thought about is, and this is one of the things that, and I'll say what kind of led me to this conclusion. One of the things that really doesn't make sense to me about this passage, about them putting on a purple cloth. So as Eli was saying, purple back then was like the Gucci of its time. Okay, it was super expensive. So the way that they would make, like today, we're so far removed from this because, like if you go to the store, like, Target, and you want a blue t-shirt or a white t-shirt or a purple t-shirt or a red t-shirt, they are going to cost the same, right? Like they're not charging you more for one color or the other, because today we have different ways of dyeing and it's not really more expensive one way or the other. So it's not that big of a deal. Not so the case back in the days, in ancient times. So purple was particularly expensive because the way that they would achieve the dye, they would basically take like a mollusk, it was some kind of shellfish. I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically what they had to do is they have to open it up, and there is basically like an organ or like a gland basically in there, and they would just basically pop it, right? Give it a little squish, and out would come this purple substance, and that would give you like 1 drop of purple dye. Okay. And so if you wanted to dye a whole piece of cloth, like a robe or something like that, it would take maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of these things, right? So you have people like, first you got to go out and fish, you got to find these things, then you got to get them out of the water, then you got to haul them back home, then you got to get someone to open them up one by one and go, you know what I mean? Just do that over and over and over and over and over. It was a very labor intensive process, but so this is one of the reasons why purple was considered very expensive, and why usually only super rich people or people in authority like kings or even priests and things that would have anything that was colored in purple. Okay. So one of the things that always made me wonder, like, why? Okay, so these Roman guards, they're playing this joke on Jesus, basically, right? They're mocking him, they're toying with him. But Jesus at this point has been beaten, he's been whipped, his body is literally like in tatters at this point. He's a bloody mess. He probably hasn't showered in a while. You know what I mean? Like, why would you? It's like if I just like took somebody like that and just threw like a like a Gucci jacket on them or something like that, or it's like it's gonna stain, it's gonna ruin the cloth. Like, why would they do this? Why would they put this really expensive piece of fabric and basically ruin it and stain it just for a joke? Well, I think the answer is that here's the other thing about the Roman guards. Roman guards were always issued red clothing. Why? Because red hides blood, and they're warriors, they're soldiers. This is also why the British, they were called the redcoats, because they wore red coats. Same idea. They wanted to hide blood stains. A, it's easier to clean, okay? But B, it's so that your people can't see that you're bleeding. You know what I mean? And because that would be a morale boost for your enemies, and it also a morale, what do you call it, detraction for your friends. Especially if you see like your general and he's bleeding, you'd be like, oh no, we're gonna die. But anyway, so that's one of the reasons I did. And Rome did the same exact thing. So what it seems to me what they did is this: they had their Roman garb that they were given basically for free as standard issue. And it seems that they put that on Jesus first as a base layer. So if that got stained, not a big deal, not really going to notice it as much. And then they put the purple robe on top of that. Okay. That's the only thing that actually makes any sense.
It was also to mock him, because even though he is king, they didn't believe it. So
well, yeah, they were doing it to mock him. But I think that, like I said, I think what they did was, so the question is like, well, did he put on a red robe or a purple robe? I think they put both on. I think he had 2 robes on. Okay, that's the thing that makes the most sense to me anyway, because it doesn't make sense that they would just throw a purple robe on. And 2 accounts say he had a purple robe. So it seems like, okay, if we're going to conclude either one, it seems more that he definitely was wearing the purple, but I think he's just wearing both is what it comes down to. Right?
And then they could take it for.
What's that?
What if he was just wearing blood?
Well, it says that they put a scarlet robe on him. So it seems somewhat to. It's not that ambiguous, it's pretty unambiguous about that. So,
and then the purple, just in case, and then blood wouldn't get on the purple robe because it was
right.
over top the red one, so they could always still keep the purple robe after it was over.
Right, exactly. So it wouldn't ruin a purple robe. That's kind of what I conclude from this, because that's actually the thing that makes the most sense to me. Now I don't know that anybody else would. I don't know that I've heard anybody else come to that conclusion, but I don't know that anybody else, saying I'm wrong either. So hey. Is what it is, I suppose. Well, it also makes sense too, because coming back to, why are we talking about this in the first place? Again, this woman that we see here is also wearing purple and scarlet, and that seems to be very reminiscent of Jesus, right? So again, coming back to this idea of like, well, something that looks like Jesus, something that looks like the church, maybe even, right? This is one of the reasons why I think that people sometimes conclude that the Catholic Church is maybe this woman. And it's a little deeper than that. Again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail, but She's also covered. She's also covered in gold, jewels, pearls. If you've been to the Vatican or anything like that, you know that they, they're decked out over there. Like all the clothing that they wear, the buildings. It's like I don't even know how many billions of dollars it's got to be worth. All that stuff, man. Like ridiculous. You know what I mean? So that part all checks out as well.
I'm a little confused. So what
Go ahead.
Does this lady have to do with the Catholic Church? I mean, Apostle Peter is the originator of the Catholic Church, right? He was
No.
the rock or something like that.
No. The Catholic Church developed that theology as a way of kind of to try to validate its own existence more or less, and they're the ones that came up with the idea of like a pope and that Peter was the first pope. A lot of problems with Catholic theology, okay? And I've had these discussions with
Catholics.
yeah, particularly there was a guy that I used to work with, and he was the only, I've met dozens and dozens and dozens of people who started out Catholic but then went to some form of Protestantism. I've only ever met one person who went the other way, went from like a Protestant denomination to a Catholic denomination, which I was like, what? So it was really intriguing. We ended up having some really interesting conversations because I had some real questions for him and things like that. But he talks about the Pope, and the thing is, like the verse that they cite about Peter being the first Pope, it's when Jesus is talking to his disciples, and this isn't working. There we go. He's talking to his disciples, and Jesus is like, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are, the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Peter, for flesh and blood has not shown you this, but the Father. And he says, on this rock I will build my church.
Right.
And that's when he changes his name from Simon to Peter, which is the same word for Petra, which means rock. Okay. And people say, this is where Peter became the head of the church. Okay, let's just say, like, I don't agree with that interpretation. I think Jesus is talking about that truth that Peter was talking about. Okay, but let's just say that Peter he was the head of the church at the time. There's literally nothing else that would indicate that he was the first in a line of popes. Okay, nothing. There's nothing that would indicate that his role or his title or whatever would be transferred to anybody else. So like the whole idea of like, oh yeah, Peter was the first pope and that's how the popes got started. And then there's this line of popes. Like there's nothing in the scriptures to back it up. It's literally zero. It's nada. It's contrived. And as we'll talk, like, a lot of the things in the Catholic Church were contrived as a way of controlling the people. Okay. Essentially. So since we're here, we'll talk about this.
And the fact that they worship things like Mary, that's really not
right. Exactly. There's emphasis placed on Mary. We're going to talk about, I'll talk about that in a second. You're getting a little ahead of me, but one of the things you have to understand about the Catholic Church is that, okay, so when the church first started, like with the apostles and everything like that, the first round of persecution came from the Jews. And that's like what the book of Acts is basically all about. It's about the church being persecuted by the Jews and them trying to work it all out with Rome. Basically, Rome was like that parent that, like, they don't really care about right or wrong. They just want peace and quiet. You know what I mean? Like, it's like when you have your brother and sister fighting and they're just like, hey, you're both in trouble now. Like, I don't care who stole from who, whatever. You're both grounded. Go be quiet. That's kind of how Rome's attitude was towards the world in general. There was enough of a disturbance from the church that they were like, all right, that's it. We're gonna just squash it. And so after the Jewish persecution came the Roman persecution. Now the thing about persecution is that it tends to make the church grow, because when when your faith might cost you your life or prison time or something like that, you get pretty serious about your faith pretty quick. And people who are really serious about their faith, they have more of an influence on people. And more people look and say, wow, this person really believes this. And so they're really living it out, right? So due to all that persecution, up to half of the Roman Empire ended up becoming Christ followers, Christians. And the Roman emperor, starting with Constantine, kind of realized, wait a minute, why are we fighting this? Like, half of our empire, the people in our empire, are following this belief. It doesn't make sense to fight half of our empire. Why don't we just join them instead? And that's exactly what they did. They started shifting. And it became, eventually, after Constantine, Christianity became the enforced religion of the empire, one of the official religion of the empire, I should say.
Was it Catholicism?
Roman Catholicism. That's why they call it Roman Catholicism. It came out of Rome. Okay. Now, as time went on, okay, they found ways of using it as a way of controlling people. And if you know anything about like the Dark Age, or what they call the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, whatever, it's a very sordid history because so much of it revolves around, well, who's Pope, and there's assassinations, there's intrigue, there's people sleeping with other, you know what I mean, like all kinds of scandal and sexual morality going on within the church. And again, because it became this system of controlling people, and it wasn't about Christ at all. And this is why they started putting in certain doctrines where it's like, okay, people are not allowed to read the Bible anymore because, hey, you can't interpret it any way. You need someone who can interpret it for you, like a priest. And so, hey, so now you have to listen to what they say about the Bible.
Is that why Catholics still do this? That today in Mass, they don't even use the Bible. They already fix thing that they're doing in Mass.
Well, the question of why, so most Catholics who are practicing Catholicism are just kind of doing what they're told. You know what I mean? They're just kind of following along.
That. I've been to
Catholic
masses, and they don't even open up the Bible. They're just
right. Yeah. And then I talked to a lady who was like super Catholic, like, had all the little statues tucked away in her house and things like that. And I remember we were talking about this. She's like, "Oh, you shouldn't read the Bible." It's like, "What do you mean you shouldn't read the Bible? Like, how do you know these people are telling you the truth if you don't know if you don't read your Bible?" And she's like, "Well, you can't. You need to be specially trained and have a special, whatever gift from God to be able to tell people what the scriptures are." And I'm just like, "Oh boy, you're being taken for one." You know what I mean? Like a wild ride here, because man, like that's the whole point of charlatans. Like they don't read the Bible. And this is one of the things about Martin Luther, because he was reading the Bible and he was the one who was basically like, wait a minute, hold up. It says in the Bible, the faith, the just shall live by faith, right? He saw that in Habakkuk, and it was cited in Romans as well. And he's like, well, wait a minute, why are people paying all this money to have their sins absolved? Why are people going to confession? And why are people like working so hard to try to achieve salvation when the Bible clearly says the just shall live by faith? And that's what led him to totally re-examine the Catholic Church and the traditions, where he nails his 95 Theses to the door, his complaints against the Catholic Church. That's how the Protestant Revolution more or less came about. But yeah, he basically, and Martin Luther certainly wasn't perfect. He had a lot of mistakes as well. There are a lot of areas, particularly when it comes to eschatology, study of end times, that he didn't examine. But hey, they made a pretty good progress from where they were, right? Which is like,
originally was Catholic and then broke off.
Correct. Yeah.
When the Lutheran Church started, right?
Well, I don't even know that he necessarily started the Lutheran Church, or other people kind of started it and named it after him. It's hard to say. It is modeled after him. The Lutheran Church is derived from Martin Luther.
Broke off the Catholic.
Correct. Yeah. He basically left the Catholic Church and started his own thing. Yeah, it was something around there. So anyway, coming back. So, and I want to say this as well. Like, not all Catholics are bad people, obviously. Like, I think there are definitely gradations. There are, I think, people who are genuine believers who are Catholic. Yeah, for sure. And then there's like people who are just, I don't know, in it for the money or the power or whatever. Like it's there's both ends that are kind of wrapped up, I would say, in the Catholic Church. I have plenty of criticisms about their beliefs. There's a lot of things that they believe that simply are not biblical, or literally counter biblical.
Or the bad things that have happened, right?
A lot of bad things have happened. Yeah, the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church is obviously bad, and that's not even looking at their past.
How does that happen if you're supposed to be supposedly Christian and crazy stuff?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from their call for celibacy. So if you want to live as a priest in the Catholic Church, you have to be celibate, or a nun. And not everybody's meant to be celibate. Like, it's just the way it is. And there's nothing in the Bible that says you have to be. Actually, quite the contrary. And the Bible talks about roles of leadership in the church, and says that he should be married to one woman. Okay, it's not saying he can be. It's like you should be married if you're going to be in a leadership role in the church. Is kind of what he's saying there. It's
just the opposite of what the Bible says.
Right. Exactly right. So So anyway, yeah, there's lots of other things. I can go on all night talking about different criticisms I have of the Catholic Church, because there are myriad. But one thing's for sure too is that the Catholic Church has a sordid present. It has even a more sordid past, between the amount of people that they've killed over the years, the amount of wars that they've been involved with over the years. I'm talking centuries. You know what I mean? Not good. And the amount of scandals, the amount of, like, it was almost like any other political power at one point. You know what I mean? It still is today. It still is a political power in a lot of ways. And people were scheming, oh, who can become the Pope, and who's gonna, what countries are gonna be favored and which ones aren't. It was just the mess, and obviously very counter biblical. And so these are all things that kind of lead. Now, so coming back to Revelation here, 17:5, where it talks about Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes and of earth's abomination. So one of the things we have to understand is that Babylon is where the pagan system that we know and think of, every other pagan system derives from Babylon for the most part, okay? Especially the ones that we see today. And we're going to talk about that next. So one of the things we have to realize is that there are very few that actually follow the paganism of Babylon as it was back in the day, but there are so many other worldviews and religions that are derivative of that system, right? And this is why it's called the mother of prostitutes. So one of those being Islam, okay? So if you're not familiar with how Islam was started, basically 300, I think it was around 300 AD, Muhammad comes onto the scene in Arabia. And at that time, the predominant system was paganism. Is a pantheistic sort of worldview, a lot of different gods, very similar to what you would see in Babylonian culture. Okay, basically derived from that. But yeah, a bunch of different gods. So similar to what we would see in the Bible with these other nations. And he was prone to what we know as epileptic seizures. So he would basically fall on the ground, would start like seizing, foaming at the mouth and things like that. And oftentimes he would wake up with like these dreams or visions or whatever you want to call them. At the time, people didn't really know what epileptic seizures were. And so they would just say, okay, well, if you're doing this, you're either possessed by a demon or a God is trying to talk to you. You know what I mean? Something like that. And because he seemed like a nice guy, they're like, well, he can't be possessed by a demon. So, hey, you must be getting visions from God. So he would start kind of writing these down and sharing them with people. And basically the visions that he got was, okay, we have this paganistic system. You have the sun god, you have the moon god, you have the god of war, you have the god of love, you have the god of everything. Okay, there's all these different gods. And he came out and said, actually, no, there's only one God, and that's the moon god, Allah. So what he did was he drew kind of from that paganistic system that kind of stemmed from Babylon, and he pulls out this derivative of it, which is what we know as Islam today, basically. Okay, so, but again, the moon god comes from this Babylonian paganistic religious system. And you can see in some of these images how the moon is depicted in Islam. So that's this crescent moon with the star. You can see it on top of this mosque right here. There's all these different flags from predominantly Muslim countries. So Algeria, Azerbaijan, Libya, Malaysia, Turkey, all these different countries have this crescent moon as part of their national identity because it's Islamic, right? It's and it derives from Allah being the moon god. Okay. Furthermore, we also have the Roman traditions, as we've kind of talked about Roman Catholicism, and we see some of these today. So one of the things you have to understand about the Roman Catholics, especially back when Rome was still around, since half of their empire was basically paganistic and the other half was basically Christian, part of it was they wanted to control it all, but they also wanted to kind of unify it. So what they would do is, okay, we have this pagan holiday called winter solstice. Winter solstice, as you are probably aware, is the shortest day of the year. And they viewed this as like the death of the sun god, because up until that point, the days are getting shorter and shorter, and the nights are getting longer and longer. And then after the winter solstice, the opposite happens. The days get longer and longer, and the nights get shorter and shorter. And they viewed this as like the death and rebirth of the sun god. And so what they would do every year to celebrate, they would take a piece of wood, what they call a Yule log. And I suspect they probably used I wouldn't be surprised if they use actually babies because at one point, because the word Yule actually means infant. And child sacrifice was nothing new to the Babylonian traditions as well. But anyway, at some point, it just became a piece of wood. So they would take this Yule log, burn it, and then the next day they would replace it with a decorated tree, basically. Okay. And that's, basically what they ended up doing in the Roman tradition was like, okay, we have this story of like death and rebirth or birth, right? Well, Jesus was born. Why don't we do that as well? We'll make 2 holidays kind of at the same time. So we'll have the winter solstice, as the pagans do, and we'll make this other one about the birth of Jesus, and then we'll celebrate them both together. So the whole empire, they're celebrating different things, but they're all celebrating at the same time together, and there you go. It's a unified empire, and that was kind of the idea behind that. A lot of these holidays, okay, as we'll see with Easter. So Easter, like people always wonder about these things. Like, wait a minute, what's the deal with the Christmas tree? Like, what does it have to do with Jesus? What do Easter bunny, like, what do eggs, what is the wassail bowl, mistletoe? Like, what does any of this have to do with anything? Well, it doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, literally nothing, but it stems back to pagan holidays and pagan traditions. So the Golden Egg of Astarte is what's kind of symbolized in eggs in Easter. Easter is just a derived word from the goddess Ishtar, who was a fertility goddess. So in the spring, the pagans, they had their fertility rites and traditions. And so they would have all these practices. Again, having kids and being fertile was a big deal to people back then. And so they would go through all these rituals. Bunnies, rabbits, as you know, they reproduce very quickly and in high abundance. So they were also symbols of fertility, and they would be used in cult practices and things like that. So
why do we use that for Easter now when Easter's about to?
Because what ended up happening is, what they ended up doing, and this is what's interesting, the early church never celebrated Easter. They celebrated Passover. And weirdly enough, because the Roman church was fairly anti-Semitic, they went through pains. Like if you ever understood like this, how they schedule Easter every year, it'll make your brain spin a little bit. It doesn't really make any sense, but they were doing that as a way of making sure that Easter never fell on Passover. They wanted to make sure that those two never were on top of each other. But what ended up happening was the Roman, again, as a way of unifying the empire, the Romans decided, okay, we're going to make these Christian holidays on the same days as these pagan holidays. So even though people are celebrating different things, they'll all be celebrating together and, whatever. And what ended up happening was these things just kind of blended together over time. So people would like, okay, they're celebrating Christmas, but they're also putting up a tree in their house, maybe just because they always did it previously. And it was like, what's wrong with putting a tree in your house? And I'm going to say this as well. I'm not saying that around Christmas you shouldn't put trees up or shouldn't, dye eggs or anything like that. Like, because today, like we none of us are thinking about Astarte or anything like that, right? Like we don't care.
What was the tree thing about?
What was the tree thing about? It was representative of the death and rebirth of the sun god, more or less.
Does the tree have anything to do with the sun?
I guess because you can burn the wood and then you can have something alive as well that you know what I mean, that you can decorate. I don't know. I think they just picked something that kind of symbolized that, even though
It's funny because my
they
dad's burning brush and Cape Cod
right now. Well, I'm sure he's not worshiping any pagan gods through it. I have no doubt. But anyway, all of these things are again stem back to Babylonian traditions. Now, I have a video I want to show you guys as well, because this kind of stuff. So we think like, oh well, the Babylon paganism of old is pretty much long gone, right? Well, kind of, yeah. At the same time, too, there's still these weird goings on. So I'm gonna play this. I'm probably gonna skip some of this because I played it last night, and I think that they're.
I was wondering, then should churches not be doing the egg thing?
No, I'm not gonna say no. I wouldn't go that far because I think a lot of it's just fun at this point. Like excuse me. Maybe God's telling me something different. I don't know. Anyway. No, I don't think that there's anything wrong with, say, like putting up a tree in your house for Christmas or dyeing eggs or whatever, because this day and age, it's so far removed from what it used to represent and things like that, that it's hard. It's really hard to say that, like, oh, if you eat chocolate bunnies, you are worshiping some sort of pagan deity or something. Like, I think that's going a little far. Now, I will say this too: if you have convictions about it, follow your convictions. Like, if you really feel like, I really don't want to have anything to do with that, like, by all means. And if you're like, no, I'm fine with doing that, I don't feel like there's anything that's gonna You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
compromise me in my faith. Yeah, I would say follow your convictions on that one. I wouldn't land too hard either way. Now, so what I have on the screen here now, this, I don't know how many of you guys have ever heard of a guy named Alex Jones by any chance. Maybe some of you. I will say this: Alex Jones is an extremely what's the word I'm looking for? Controversial character. And I definitely don't endorse everything he says or does or anything like that. Okay, so let me just point that out very clearly. However, he's been right about a number of things, which is kind of creepy. And he's, you know, people who try to disparage him say, oh, he's a right-wing conspiracy theorist, which he might even embrace, to be perfectly honest, because he kind of is. But weirdly enough, he's been wrong about a lot of things. He's been right about a lot of things as well. Namely, he was one of the first people to be talking about an island where the wealthy and powerful would go to basically satisfy their sexual urges, right? You've heard of, and people that said that's whacked out conspiracy nonsense, that's tinfoil hat stuff. Fast forward 10 years, and we find out about Jeffrey Epstein, who in fact had an island where he was taking people, including presidents and senators and other famous, powerful people, to basically go and have a party on this island. And, you know, there's been reports of underage girls as well. And so creepy stuff, to say the least. But anyway, that was all blown by Alex Jones. Okay, so some of the things he says are crazy, and they seem crazy at the time, and then later down the road, he ends up, you know, being validated. So this video right here is from a place called Bohemian Grove. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. It's another one of those places that like conspiracy theorists love to talk about. This is another place that the very wealthy and powerful have been known to go to, including presidents, including senators. And I've done some research on Bohemian Grove. Obviously, you got to be careful what you research, because around anything, there's going to be a lot of misinformation, disinformation. You know, I've heard senators that are saying like, oh, it's just like a huge frat party where people are basically just like letting loose, drugs, alcohol, prostitutes, all that stuff. There's that. There's also some kind of weird stuff going on there as well. And this is a video that was smuggled by Alex Jones. He took a hidden camera. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it is, I even fast forwarded it a little bit and edited some stuff out. It's kind of long and boring.
What is that light part? Is that?
So what's happening here is like all the people, kind of looks like that. All the people who are, there's people in the audience who are gathered here to watch this thing. This is like the opening ceremonies or whatever. And there's all these people. It's hard to see because the video quality is real bad. It's a hidden camera. But there's all these guys up on this stage area. There's this giant owl statue. There's an altar. And they're all wearing robes and things like that. Okay, so it's like, wait, what? And basically what happens here, they have this big ceremony. They call it the Cremation of Care. It's very like druidic. It draws from a lot of things, right? Druid practices, Freemason practices, and some Babylonian practices as well. My understanding is that they consider this owl to be the god Molech. If you've heard of Molech, Molech comes up in the scriptures. Molech was a god that they would burn people to, basically, alive. Oftentimes babies, oftentimes infants. They would kill their babies by burning them in front of either on Molech or in front of Molech. So anyway, now I'm going to say this as well. Like this, a lot of the people that are probably sitting in the audience for this probably have like no idea what's going on. They think it's just like a show or something like that. But it would be, I think, naive to think that there's not something darker going on, especially in the background. You know what I mean? Like deeper, that's not being shown to everybody. So anyway, I was going to show some of this real quick, and we'll kind of go from there. But sorry if you can't. The sound's coming through here.
And all within the grove be reverent before him. Lift up your heads, O ye trees, and be ye lifted up, ye everlasting spires. For behold, here is Bohemian shrine, and holy are the pillars of this mountain.
There's like an owl statue basically right back here where these people are.
Hail, Bohemians!
What's going on?
With the ripple of water, song of birds,
Basically, there's all these people watching what's going on. And there's all these dudes in robes that are putting on this ritual, basically.
Behold, in this great structure of world Jesus, so in his words, harmony. As vanished Babylon and fiddling Tyre, so shall they also vanish. But the wailing rose blows on the broken battlements of Tyre, and walks rend the stones of Babylon. For beauty is eternal, and we bow to beauty everlasting. For lasting happiness in flame awaits the corpse of care.
So this is where they bring in
Thus buried,
let's see, fast forward a little bit.
bury with
Explain it a little bit.
When will you learn that me you cannot slay? Here and here.
So they go on for a while. This goes on for a while, where they're supposed to be talking to this personages of care, basically. So hold on a second. I'll skip to the end kind of here, where they actually. Yeah, you can find this online. This is the owl statue. The owl statue kind of talks to them. And then they have a. So I'll kind of explain it in a second. But this is where they burn this effigy basically right here.
Fire shall have its will of thee. Behold, no care, and all the winds make merry with thy nuts. Hail, fellowship's eternal flame. Once again, midsummer sets us free.
Yeah, and then they burn it alive, and there you go. Okay, so it's creepy and also kind of like ridiculous at the same time. Like the kids, I was thinking that they might get a little freaked out by it, but they were like laughing the whole time because it's almost like a bad Disney show. This is a meme that I found online, but it kind of shows what was going on there. It says, because it's perfectly normal for the world's elite to do mock sacrifices under a giant owl statue. So basically what's going on in this ritual is, and a lot of it I skipped, a lot of it you can't see, but it gets explained. You can look it up online if you want. Just do a little Google searching, it'll come up. I'm sure there's like a 2-hour.
What's it called?
I forget off the top of my head. If you Google search Bohemian Grove and like undercover footage or something like that, there's like a 2-hour documentary that Alex Jones did just on this event. And I haven't.
He's a radio.
He was on the radio. Now he has his website. He's been banned from like Twitter and like YouTube and everywhere.
He's very loud. And
yeah. And again, I'm not going to endorse everything that he does. Like I would take him with a huge grain of salt and be careful what you believe because he's been wrong about a lot of stuff too. And I would also say that I haven't watched his whole 2-hour documentary on this matter, so I don't know how correct he is about some of the assertions that he makes. I'm sure there's some things that he is correct about. But basically in this process, this is what happens just before the party gets started. And part of it to like, hey, like stop worrying about the world, just basically cut loose. That's like the purpose of this ceremony. So what they do is it's really weird. These guys are dressed up in robes, they bring torches. They have this whole like mock conversation with this care character, which is this effigy, and then they're like talking to this owl god statue of like, hey, what should we do? And it's really bizarre. There's like this guy. There's a part where this guy is coming across a rowboat. He has like a skull face, basically. I don't know if it's a mask or if it's paint or something like that. But then they basically bring this body and then they light it on fire. And now they, obviously they're saying that it's not a real person. Probably isn't a real person if I had to guess, but who knows? Maybe at one point in time, maybe it was a real person, right? I don't know.
Are they trying to access the other world? Is that, you know what I mean?
I think that what this ultimately is a blending of Druidic culture, which is basically in Ireland. If you're familiar with the Druids, they were like very occultic, very, very all about like nature and things like that, and would do like human sacrifices and ritualistic stuff, kind of like you're seeing here. Freemasonry is another thing that they're probably drawing from here, which also similar aspects, and Babylonian. They even mentioned Babylon in this little
Is that
presentation
where the
here.
Aztecs got that from? South American.
Yeah, right.
Is
The,
that all based on the same-
there's a lot of similarities. So the Aztecs and the Incans are another topic entirely. And boy, oh boy, do I have things to say about that. There are some conjectures that, and it's really interesting. There are some conjectures that the giant, oh man, I don't want to get too deep in this because it's really fascinating. But so in the book of,
Stuff all, it was based on the old.
okay, so in the book of Joshua, you are, if you're familiar with that book, you realize that it's this conquest of Israel and they're slaying the inhabitants of the land. But I talked about how there was giants in the land. Okay, so they're fighting giants and things like that. What's interesting is that we see these huge changes in the Incan and Mayan civilizations around that time. Okay, there are people, I've heard some biblical scholars who have conjectured that it's possible that the Israelites didn't kill all the giants. Some of them fled, and it's possible that some of them fled to South and somehow ended up in South and Central America. And what's weird is that there are a lot of things about the Mayan and Incan civilizations that really make people scratch their heads a lot. The nature of how their civilizations were set up is pretty impressive. Some of their technological capabilities were pretty impressive.
They got a crazy calendar.
Crazy calendar, yeah. Like they're really big, and they had a lot of the similar cultic practices as ancient Babylon, and they were also very bloodthirsty, like very bloodthirsty. Have you guys ever seen the movie Apocalypto? Mel Gibson came with it. I would be cautious in watching that because it is
Graphic.
very graphic, and it's like, whoa, man, like we kind of feel bad that these civilizations got wiped out, but at the same time, you look at what they were doing, you're like, oh my gosh, like that's pretty dark. You know what I mean? Like killing 10,000 people in a day just by ritual sacrifices and things like that, like hunting down people so that they could sacrifice them alive.
And
Like,
it goes back to Babylon, you think?
well, it's a conjecture. You know what I mean? Like, because there are some strange similarities. Okay, and how they worshipped and
And they were
whatnot.
quite heavy drugs too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, licking frogs and eating mushrooms and all kinds of stuff. Ayahuasca comes from that area, which is something that people are getting into these days as well. There's a lot of weird stories when you hear about Native American history. You hear talks about, like, Buffalo Bill collected some of these stories about giant people living at the time who could run up next to a buffalo and like tackle them and basically rip off their legs and just start eating it. One of the things that they talk about is too that we think this is very Hollywood eyes, but the idea that natives would kind of come to each other and say how, the how part is probably not real, but they would in fact lift up their hands to show that they had 5 fingers, because they were the dreaded 6-fingered people who lived there, who were extremely violent and all this stuff. Like, I know it sounds weird, but hey, if you can do your own research, good. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, it could just be. Well, that's the thing. Also an American. So yeah, the idea that what was going on in the book of Genesis about the fallen angels coming and impregnating women and all that stuff, could that just been happening? Yeah, it very well could have been. And as a matter of fact, there's also talk in Native American lore about the star people who came down and did basically exactly that. So these are all conjectures. You kind of look up all this on your own. This is getting a little
It's
off
like a
topic.
connection.
Yeah, there's connections there. So anyway, whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, I just saw today there's leaked footage from the Navy of more UFOs, and they are pyramid shaped, flying around in the sky. just got leaked. I forget when it got leaked, but I just saw it today. Very recent footage. So more and more of this stuff kind of keeps coming out, and it's a little weird, right? That it keeps. Oh, this is what we're talking about now, huh? But anyway, all this to say, coming back to the book of Revelation here, this idea, Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes, so many of the paganistic systems that we see today are either mixed with Babylonian traditions or directly come from the Babylonian traditions, even in things like the Catholic Church, for example. Okay, let's keep moving on. I think we're a little behind, so let's just keep going here. So Revelation 17:6, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. Okay, what in the world is he talking about there, right? So a couple of things to say. The woman is drunk with the blood of the saints. So she is obviously responsible for the death of the saints, whether they're Christians or whoever. This is specifically talking about in the Great Tribulation. Could be both. The Catholic Church is happens to be one of the greatest persecutors of the church. So more than any of the Roman emperors, more than even a lot of the like socialists, like the USSR, communist China, they have their millions of people they've killed, but the Catholic Church has killed millions of Christians over the years, over the centuries. Okay, so they definitely fit the bill as far as being drunk with the blood of the saints. Now today, one of the biggest persecutors of the church is Islam, right? So in a lot of Islamic countries, this is where you hear about some of the most intense persecution being carried out against Christians. So this is another thing that, again, I'm kind of giving both these counterpoints. And so, yeah, so there's that, right? And so this angel basically, so John's looking at this and it's like, what? He says he's marveling at it. And he explains kind of what's going on here. So verse 8 is definitely the confusing part, I would say. So this beast, right, that was, is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. Okay, so what are you talking about? Well, actually, let's move on to the next verses, and hopefully it'll clarify things a little bit more. Verse 9, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. For as for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. So what is he talking about here? So one of the things I do have to point out real quick as somewhat of a conjecture, and this was pointed out again by Dave Hunt, and you can kind of take it or leave it. I don't know how compelling I find this to be, but one of the interesting things is, I didn't know this, but Rome is actually referred to as the city on 7 hills. So as you can see here is a map, and you can see I'm not going to read them all, but there's Quirinal Hill, I'm probably butchering it, Viminal Hill, Capitoline Hill, and it goes all the way down. There's 7 of them. And as you can see in the top left corner here is the Vatican, which is obviously the home of the Pope and, the Roman Catholic Church. So there are some who would point that out and say, oh, this woman, she sits on 7 mountains or hills. And so that points to the church, to the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, maybe that's very possible. Now, here's the thing, though. It says that these 7 mountains are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. So the word here for kings can mean kings or kingdoms. It's kind of the same word, but it's saying he. So it seems to be referring to rulers. Now, one of the things we have to realize about the Bible is that it's really only looking at empires as they pertain to the nation of Israel. Okay, so during this time in China and Japan, you have all these different dynasties and empires. You have the Mongolian Empire, and then you have what's going on in Central America at the time, right? And the Bible kind of ignores all of those because they don't have really anything to do with Israel. Okay, now what are the nations and empires that have had biblical relevance to the nation of Israel? Well, obviously, the first one is the nation of Egypt. So you'll obviously remember when Israel went into Egypt, they ended up becoming slaves, and they ended up getting out of Egypt. Interestingly enough, I don't know how they confirm this or not, but I've heard from biblical scholars that the Pharaoh when Israel was in Egypt was actually an Assyrian, interestingly enough. I don't know how they confirm that or know that. It might be from Josephus. I can't remember. But that's interesting to know, because we're going to come to this again in a minute. But Egypt, that's the first nation to have any real serious significance with Israel as far as world empires go. Okay, the next world empire to have a huge impact on Israel is the nation of Assyria. Assyria was the nation, the world empire that dominated for a while, and they are the ones that basically eradicated the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes in the north.
What's Assyria today?
Assyria is not around today. Assyria does not have an empire. We're gonna get to that in a second. You're getting ahead of me again.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all good. But we're gonna talk about that momentarily. The next one is obviously Babylon. So after the northern kingdom was carried away, Babylon takes care of the rest of it. Judah and Benjamin, the last two tribes in Israel. And so Babylon is the next world empire. And then after this, we see the dream from Daniel. And this leads us to the Medo-Persian Empire, who essentially took over Babylon and consequently Israel as well, followed by the Greek Empire, which conquered the Persian Empire and again more or less became in control of Israel, that general region, followed by Rome. And then, as we know, in the Bible, there's going to be another one, Rome 2.0, right? But Daniel talks about that. So let's stop here for a second.
Is that in order?
Yes, these are the ones that are coming. Now, at the time when John is writing this, okay, honestly, let me go back here. He says there are 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. So what is he saying here? So when John is alive at the time, Rome is the dominant empire right now. So as you can see, we're up to 6. So Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. That's 6. And he says that 5 have fallen and 1 is. Okay, so that's what he's saying here. Right now, at his time, Rome is the dominant empire. And 5 others have fallen before: Greece, Medo, Persia, Babylon, Syria, Egypt. You with me so far? And he says there's 1 yet to come, which is Rome 2.0 essentially. And then he says there's basically 1 other. It's the 8th, but it's of the 7. What does that mean? Well, this is where people can again conjecture that it's a reference to Assyria, that the Antichrist, the world leader, is going to be an Assyrian, and that's kind of what it's talking about. It says, as for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to 7, and it's going to arise. So that's the idea of these empires, okay? At the time of John's writing, Egypt is around, okay? Babylon is around. It's today we know it as Iraq, okay? Medo-Persia is still around. Persia, it's known as Iran today. Greece hasn't changed name, still around. Rome, we refer to as Italy today, right? And even more, you might even say the European Union. As a matter of fact, it could be considered Rome as well. So that's still around. And we know from prophecy that Rome is going to revive again into another world empire, essentially. But there's one that's not around anymore, and that's Assyria. Assyria is not a country anymore, and it hasn't been since it was basically eradicated in ancient times, okay? So, but interesting enough, there are still Assyrians alive today. They're in pockets, and they're kind of scattered throughout the world. And so I'm giving you my best conjecture about what this means, basically. I think what this is talking about is saying that this final world leader, as I said, these are 7 kings that it talks about, these 7 heads. There's another one coming, and he's from an empire that was and is not, but is going to rise up from the pit, essentially. And I think that's what he's talking about. So he's saying that this, and there's other, as we've talked about this in other passages in the Bible, talking about the final world leader being an Assyrian.
Where geographically is
Syria? Assyria was a bit north of Israel. It was kind of parts of Turkey and I think parts of Iraq as well. So it kind of spanned all of that, but it got conquered by the Babylonian Empire, and eventually it just kind of fell apart and never came back, essentially. So anyway, so that's my best interpretation of what this more or less means, because it's really confusing when you first read it. You're like, but the beast that was and is not is an eighth, but it belongs to the seven. Like what? Well, that kind of makes sense in this regard. If it's a reference to Assyria, yeah, it was an empire at one point, and then not only did it fall, but it actually got wiped out and never came back. And but it's of the seven that fell, these first ones that come here. So anyway, that's more or less my interpretation, or not even mine. Other people I've heard who have interpreted that way, and that's the only thing that makes sense to me, frankly. But again, you guys can kind of do your own study, come up to your own conclusions, but be on the lookout.
How do you know what conclusion?
Well, time will tell, man. That's the thing. I think at this point we're just like, not all the pieces have quite fallen into place yet. And so as time goes on, those pieces will fall into place, and a lot of these things will become a lot more clear. Right now, we're kind of like, we're using these cryptic messages and stuff like that to look into the future and try to see like, hey, what's coming? But it's, like I said, it is cryptic, and it is hard to tell like how to actually understand some of these things, like Babylon, for example. Is this literally the city Babylon, or is this like a metaphor for something else? Like there are people who go both ways on that one, and thinking that like, well, it represents the Babylonian system, which migrated over time. It started in Babylon, but then it went to Persia, and then it went to Greece, and then it went to Rome. And we even see this in just the renaming of the gods. So you get gods like Ishtar, who ends up becoming Astarte, who ends up becoming Aphrodite, who ends up becoming Venus, right? It's like the same, Zeus becomes Jupiter. They have Greek names and then Roman names. Like it's the same gods, but they kind of migrate and they change names as they go along, to whatever language that they're in at that point. And it's interesting that like you said before, how Mary sounds very similar to some of these gods, and there are other people who have made that connection as well. And it's interesting because, the Catholic Church, despite the fact that they'll say that they don't venerate Mary higher than Christ, at the same time, in deeds, it certainly seems like they do, right? Because they probably pray more to Mary than they do to God or Jesus himself, right? There's all these statues and visions of Mary, and it's weird because these ancient cultures also seem to venerate these women goddesses as well, and it's the parallels. I'm not the only one who's, there's other people who have made that connection.
I guess it's because it's Jesus' mom that they think he's divine.
It's also quite possible that they, again, are just relabeling these goddesses like Ishtar, Astarte, and they're just like, you know what, we're going to give her a paint job. It's Mary now. You know what I mean? Like very similar in a lot of their beliefs and, their reverence and things like that, but whatever. It's obviously not like an apples to apples. There's obviously some changes that are made along the way, but the similarities are too weird to ignore.
I mean, she was just ordinary. She was just God's path to bring his son in. I mean, I don't know why they have to think she's divine. She was just another woman, really.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not biblical, but again, I think that it's the biblical illiteracy of Catholics that lets the Catholic Church get away with a lot of this stuff. You know what I mean? Like that's honestly what it is, and that's why they're told, "Hey, don't read your Bibles. You're only going to be able to know it, if a priest tells you it, because then they just never learn the truth."
He actually says some of this stuff like in a Catholic Church.
I don't think I'd be killed, but yeah, they probably wouldn't want me back. You know what I mean? I don't think I'd be invited to speak again. I'll say that much.
No, but if you said like ordinary person just sitting in and said something, would that?
Well, I don't think you get a lot of chance. You don't get much chance to talk in mass or anything like that, unless you're like chanting with what everybody else is saying. I guess
unless you talk to the priest after, right?
I guess, but
what if you
good luck with that.
Priest and confronted him with
I think that they usually have some. So when I was talking to this guy I worked with, who was like, he went like full Catholic, like he was super into everything, and I would have conversations with him, and at the end of the day, he didn't have a lot of good answers for me, but he was willing to overlook that. It seems it's just like, man, like you have to really like take a lot of the Bible very loosely in order to believe what you believe. Like, and I think he was like, yeah, that's pretty much it. We just don't take it very literally. We just take it very, like they're just saying, if you torture the data, it will confess to anything. And it's like anything else. You take a text, you take any sort of information and you torture it, like you can get it to say whatever you want. You know what I mean? Doesn't mean that's what it was being intended. It doesn't mean it makes sense, but hey, you can justify anything you want as long as you, twist it in the right way. So I think that's more or less what was kind of happening there. But Anyway.
What's the next?
Anyway, all right, we still have a little more to get through. We only got 10 minutes to do it. So hopefully we're going to do this, but let's keep moving. So verse 12, and the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. So along with this final ruler, again, we call him the Antichrist or the pseudo-Christ, there's going to be 10 other kings who are going to be ruling with him. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and beautiful. Interestingly enough, there is I posted this somewhere today because I was doing research, well, not today, within the past week, because I was doing research on this, and the post I made was when your conspiracy theory has a website. There is an organization called the Club of Rome. And basically what you can go on their website, they have a website, clubofrome.org, and they are very powerful and influential people who are basically working together to shift humanity in a lot of different ways, from economics to politics and all kinds of things. And interestingly enough, from what I understand, they have actually divided the earth into 10 different regions as well. Ironically, right? So whatever. I mean, hey, maybe it's just a weird coincidence. Very well could be, but it's strange that they call themselves the Club of Rome, and they're trying to influence things, and they're, it's a little too weird to be comfortable, right? So if you want to ever look them up. You want to look them up, you can, clubofrome.org. Of course, they put a nice happy face on, but it's like, I don't know, that seems a little strange, right? Sounds all well and good, but who knows? So we see these rulers, 10 rulers, they are joining with the beast, and it says that they're of one mind, they're of one purpose. Okay, we're gonna see this word come again. So they all have the same intentions, the same agenda, is what we're seeing here. Okay, and they make war against Jesus. We'll see that in the Battle of Armageddon, and it's not going to go well for them, as you can imagine. Verse 15, and the angel said to me, the waters that you saw, we've talked about this already, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Okay, so we're going to see more about the city of Babylon. And the question is, okay, is this the literal city Babylon that is in Iraq today, that was of old, where Nebuchadnezzar was king? Or is this just some sort of metaphor for the Babylonian system and the seat of power and the religious system, and that it migrates over time? Hard to say. There are some people that go both, that try, they're good scholars on both sides. They say, no, it's literal Babylon. And other people say, nope, it's like the Vatican. The Vatican's going to get wiped out or something like that, because there's a judgment that's coming on to Babylon. And as we see here with this world empire, this woman, she's riding the beast for a while. It says that the beast is carrying her, but eventually it turns on her. It hates her. So one of the things I can't help but notice is there's a very similar, like, there are so many similarities between Hitler and the Antichrist. It's no wonder that so many people literally thought he was the Antichrist, and people who didn't think that were considered fringe idiots at the time. But there were a number of people who said, no, this can't be the guy, because Israel's not back in the land. There's so many promises that are made to Israel, and everybody's like, you're crazy. Those are all, none of those are literal prophecies. They're metaphorical. And, this is clearly the guy that we've been, trying to avoid or whatever. And turned out not to be the case. And it turns out that, yes, Israel had to be back in the land. So those people who were considered fringe idiots were actually very correct and basically, justified. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Doesn't matter. We're going to go with it. Justified in their thinking. Now, interestingly enough, Hitler, one of the things that he did was he hated religion. Okay, he was not a fan. There's some people who say that he was, Hitler was a Christian. Yeah, no.
He is pagan ideals, right? He is pagan ideals.
Well, yeah, he weirdly enough was very much into a lot of this occultic practices that we see again that have a lot of ties to Babylon.
Even the Nazi swastika.
Yeah, it's a symbol of death, basically. But
It's like an Indian.
yeah, it's actually it comes from Eastern imagery. Sometimes people get that confused. So if you make the swastika go backwards, it basically is a symbol for life in like Buddhist teachings and things like that. But if you go the other way, it's death, and people sometimes get that confused because sometimes they'll see it in different Buddhist like sculptures or whatever. They're like, oh, it's Nazis. It's like no. This came before the Nazis, and this means life, and that one means death. So whatever. That's neither here nor there. One of the interesting things about Hitler, okay, so coming back to this, he hated religion, despised it, but he made like an alliance with the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church not only made this alliance with Hitler, they also did so with Benito Mussolini, who was the fascist dictator of Italy during World War II. Okay. Now,
Tojo, right?
What's that?
Tojo, did they do?
No, they didn't really have much involvement with the East. Japan was largely kind of doing its own thing. They were so Hitler and Mussolini, they were kind of allies, but they didn't really. They're kind of too far away to actually do anything with each other. They worked together to some degree, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm not trying to get too deep into World War II here, yeah, it's just interesting to me that Hitler also despised the Catholic Church, but he used it for his own purposes. Okay, by getting the Catholic Church under his belt, basically, he was more able to manipulate Germany and Europe in general.
And killing of the Jews too.
Yeah, well, that was a part of it, I suppose. But yeah, and so it seems like what we're seeing here in the book of Revelation, similar sort of thing is happening. These rulers who rule this world empire, they seem to be like they hate this religious system, whether it's Roman Catholicism, whether it's Islam, or whether it's a conglomeration of all of them, which I kind of tend to lean towards. They hate it, but they use it for a while. And eventually when they don't need it anymore, they just basically destroy it. Okay, that seems to be the imagery that's happening. We'll get more into this in the next chapter, and we'll look a little more in detail about some of these things, about the destruction that's going to come upon Babylon, and whether it's a literal city, which I kind of lean towards, or whether it's something more metaphorical. We'll talk about why I tend to think it's literally Babylon. And I think this is another one of those things where it's like, people were expecting prophecy to unfold, but Israel wasn't there yet. So therefore, like some people recognize, no, the end can't be that close because we're still waiting for that piece to fall into place. Babylon is like that, in my opinion. I think that's the piece we're waiting to see, because we're going to see Babylon is going to become a place of trade. It's going to be a huge commercial spot again, because we're going to see the people that get most upset by the destruction of Babylon are the merchants, the people who trade by ships, and the kings of the earth. And so why is that? Well, I think that Babylon is yet to emerge on the scene. Now, maybe it happens after, or during the first 3 years of the final week of Daniel. You know what I mean? Maybe it happens very quickly, but who knows? We're gonna talk about that more as we kind of get into the next chapter, because the next chapter is going to expound a lot more on this. But so anyway, I think I tend to lean. Okay, so the question is, well, is this Babylon the Catholic Church or whatever? I think that's a part of it. I don't necessarily know that it's only the Catholic Church, because for a while, when I first started studying this years ago, I was, it's the Catholic Church. Okay. But then you start reading more. I'm like, well, it also could be Islam. Like there's a lot of parallels there as well. And then you do more studying, like, well, a lot of parallels between the Catholic Church as well. One of the things that really tips me off too is that this woman wears scarlet and purple. To me, that's like this woman's projecting this image of Christ, essentially, because again, he's the only other person I can think of in the scripture that wore scarlet and purple. Okay. Interestingly enough, too, the Pope is referred to as the Vicar of Christ. If you put that phrase in Greek, that's where we get the word Antichrist from, or the pseudo-Christ. It's like in place of Christ. Same exact Greek phrase, okay, which is a little strange. You'd think that somebody would have picked up on that a while ago, but there it is. What's that? No, it doesn't sound good at all. Vicar of Christ sounds a little better. It sounds a little slicker, like, hey, the vicar, yeah. Well, really, it's like in place of Christ, right? It's kind of it's the same word. So there's that. Interestingly enough, too, though, okay, a couple other interesting points I got to make here. Over the past decades, there's been a few different popes, not many, but a few. And it seems like they all have this agenda to try to unite the world religion. So you see them like visiting the Dalai Lama, visiting Islamic sheiks and leaders. And you'll hear the Pope saying things like, "Oh, I'm not here to tell you anything. I'm just here to learn." And over the decades, there's been this attempt to kind of buddy with all of these world religions. And I suspect that the final world religion is going to be this united front, because I think they all do kind of stem from Babylon. So again, we talked about Islam being directly drawn from the paganism. We talked about how all the Babylonian traditions and whatnot that are woven in through the Catholic Church. And this, even if you look in areas like Hinduism, there are a lot of parallels. They're pantheistic and they have all kinds of gods and whatnot.
What's the whole thing with like the Pope being a direct descendant, something with God?
Yeah, he's considered like a direct representative of Jesus, basically. That's their belief, which is
ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a little ridiculous. There's again nothing in the Bible that would suggest that. Like you have to really twist some scripture to try to believe that.
It'd be a big stretch.
It's a stretch. Oh, it's a stretch to say the least. Yeah, a huge stretch. So there's that. One of the other really weird things about the Catholic Church is there is a telescope. Actually, they own a lot of different telescopes. And the most high-powered telescopes in the world. One of them is actually in Arizona, which one I understand is also a ritual site for Native Americans, weirdly enough, that's related to the Star People or something like that. So the Vatican owns a telescope on this hill in Arizona, on this holy site, basically, or near a holy site of these Native American tribes. And I think they're actually not very happy about that they build it there. The VATT is what it's called. It's the Vatican something. I forget the acronym now. It's like it's like something about alternate technology or advanced technical telescope or something like that. The Vatican Advanced Technological Telescope. I forget exactly, something like that. VATT. You can look it up. There's a guy by the name of Tom Horn. I was listening to him. He was in affiliation with K-House Ministries to some degree. And supposedly, I heard him talk about this. He claims to have gone to the VATT and actually spoken with people there and asked them, like, what are you guys looking for here? Like, you guys are working, you're owned by the Catholic Church. Like, what is it? What's their interest? And they'll say, like, yeah, they're supposedly they're looking for extraterrestrial life. That's their main goal. And supposedly these are all things I've heard over the years. Okay, and so if you ask me, hey Ben, where did you hear that from? I couldn't tell you specifically. Some of this is from Tom Horn, some from other people, so you can look it up on the internet yourself if you'd like to. But evidently, there are people who have claimed that the Catholic Church is expecting a time where we are going to come into contact with extraterrestrials. And they are trying to figure out, well, what happens to the Catholic Church if that happens? Because that obviously would be quite a huge curveball. How do we get it to make sense? And so imagine what would happen. Like, imagine if aliens did just start showing up and before people, like, what would happen with the religions of the world? There's a part of me that thinks that they would almost have to unite. You know what I mean? Like, they would have to come together and probably alter their beliefs, you know what I mean, come to something in more accordance with each other. And I think that might be what we're looking at here with this Babylon, mystery Babylon, essentially. I don't know. I could be totally wrong. This is my best conjecture. This is kind of how I think of it and where I lean. But yeah, that's kind of where I think we're going. So yeah, it's all very weird. And again, it's called Mystery Babylon for a reason. Like, it's something on the mystery of Babylon. Like, it's something that hasn't been revealed yet. It's something that's been kept under wraps. It's a secret. So hey, I could be totally wrong. Like, everything I'm saying could be totally off. I don't know. But based off of what I'm reading in scriptures and what I've seen going on in the world today, and from other people that I've heard, this is the best I got. So we'll find out for sure one of these days. Yeah, it's a city, and I do tend to think that it is. So again,
Why would they be that specific?
Right, I do think that this is literally a specific city. I think it is a literal city that's going to be destroyed. Like, and it is going to be destroyed. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about next week in more detail: the destruction of Babylon. And again, like as we talked about before, we see some of these symbols. Like, so for example, this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, like it's representative when it says the beast, it's representative of the world empire. It's representative of the leader of the world empire. It can also represent the spiritual force behind that world empire. And so I think this woman is similar. I think that it's like a religious system that's located in a city and also has a definitive leader as well. Like I think those all apply to this simultaneously, same as those other like empires that we saw, those beasts. And so I do tend to think that it is a literal city. I tend to lean towards the idea that Babylon is going to come back as a major player in the world and that it's going to be destroyed. We're going to see in the next, what we said in the next chapter, there's some key prophecies like Babylon's going to be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's going to be destroyed within an hour, that nobody will ever live there again, that no building materials will ever be used there again, that shepherds won't go there anymore, that Arabs won't visit there anymore. All of these things, when you start putting these together, it sounds like a nuclear bomb is going to go off, because that would make sense. Irradiation would keep anybody from going back there. A nuclear blast would definitely keep anything from ever being rebuilt ever again. And it says that specifically, that things aren't going to be, the building materials aren't going to be used again. And that's not the case now. We see now that Babylon is being rebuilt, and they're using a lot of the ruins and ancient structures that are still there to make those rebuilds.
Where is
Babylon's in Iraq. So it's southern Iraq over by the Euphrates River, basically. And yes,
the Garden of Eden, right?
That's why I conjectured that. Yeah, I conjectured that could be potentially where the Garden of Eden was literally located. But that's a conjecture, I would say. Something I kind of lean on a little bit, but I would, obviously caution leaning on it too heavily. But yeah, so there's a lot of things that seem to indicate that, like, wait a minute, this is a literal city, and I think it's literally Babylon. That tends to be my view. Something like that. Yes, so this final world empire ends up hates this religious system, but it kind of uses it for its own purposes, and then eventually turns on it when it doesn't need it anymore and destroys it. That's the idea. Yeah, until the words of God are fulfilled. And again, I wanted to try to do 17 and 18 together because they very much go hand in hand. But we're out of time, so we'll get to it next week, and we'll dive a little deeper into some of these things. But yes, this is one of the things that makes me think, like, okay, like there are times in life, particularly now, where it feels like this is it. Like this has to be the end, right? It's too weird. Too many things are going on. Too many things make sense. But this is definitely one of the biggest pieces in the puzzle that's not in place yet. Like the idea that Babylon is going to be resurrected. Now, one of the things that got people excited, though, was the Iraq War back in the early 2000s, because a lot of prophecy buffs were like, oh my gosh, like Iraq, that's where Babylon's located. And now there's this big war. And now the dictator's being toppled. And what's going to happen after that? And that's when people started getting, like the US military started getting access to Babylon. They started taking video. And I remember seeing images of helicopters going around this temple that Saddam Hussein rebuilt. He apparently thought he was like almost like the spiritual successor to Nebuchadnezzar. And so he fancied himself like this big world leader. And so he started rebuilding Babylon, and a lot of the like the temple or the palace, Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the Ishtar Gate has been rebuilt, a lot of it. So anyway, all that to say, the people who think that, all those prophecies about Babylon have already been fulfilled. No, there are some things that just have not happened yet. Like the eradication of Babylon, like it talks about, has not been seen, because people are living there today. It says it will no longer be inhabited. It says the building material is never going to be reused. Well, they've been reused, and a lot of it's been rebuilt. So anyway, we'll see what happens, man. I think, I don't know. We don't know how world events are going to play out and unfold, but I think that there are people who do have a genuine interest in Babylon, particularly the people who are into occultic practices and whatnot. I think that I don't know what it is. I'm not a part of it, so I don't know what their plans are exactly, but I think that's something that we're going to be needing to keeping an eye on in the future. So again, we'll talk about this more next week, but with that, let's see if anybody has any questions or any final comments. We'll close in prayer and we'll call it a night.
You know the movie Argo? Do you remember that?
Argo? Yeah.
With-
Yeah, with Ben Affleck.
Yeah, with the dictator there. What was his name?
Oh, it was the Sheikh of I forget what his name was. Yeah, I know who you're talking about though. He was not a nice guy in Iran. He was
Is that considered Babylon?
Persia. Iran is
Persia.
yeah, Iran is what we think of as Persia. Or Persia we think of as Iran today.
Okay. The
Yeah.
Persians and Babylonians.
Different people. Different people.
Different
Yeah, so
times or no?
well, no, similar time. So Babylon is in modern day Iraq. And the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes are the modern day Kurds, and the Persians are the modern day Iranians. They were separate people groups, and the Iranians or the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon. So they existed at the same time.
They didn't like each other.
No, you could say that they didn't like each other very much. When you're warring with another nation, you don't like each other so much.
They're
Yeah.
both Muslim.
They weren't Muslims at the time. No, this is before Islam. This is in the BCs rather than the ADs. So Islam didn't emerge on the scene until like 300 AD.
Were they pagan?
Yeah, they're different forms of paganism, basically. Yeah, pretty much.
Your video reminds me of, you ever hear of the Burning Man Festival?
Burning Man Festival. Yeah, it's a little creepy, right? It's a little strange. It's like, well, they're all doing drugs out there, and then in the middle of the desert.
Corporate guys are being flown in there, super campers.
Yeah. And again, I don't think most people view it as paganistic. They're just like, whatever, dude, like we're going to get stoned and burn a giant, thing and listen to music. I think that's about as far as it goes for most people. Is there more to it? It does seem very druidic. I will say that, like a little too much so, in my opinion. So yeah. And it's weird, man. Like you don't know what else is going on in the background, but I think, the weirdest thing is that we usually tend to think of people who are in occultic practices as being like very fringe wackos and weirdos. Like they're not really in general society. They're somewhere off in the woods by themselves. And it's like, no, like some of the most wealthy and powerful people are involved in this stuff and probably using it, literally using these dark powers to their advantage, to their demise as well. But at the moment, their advantage. So I think there's something to that. Yeah.
It's attracting the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's attracting. Yeah, I think people are attracted to it, and I think that yeah, it's creepy, man. It's on the rise in a lot of regards. Witchcraft and all that stuff has been on the rise in the modern world in the West for a number of years. So Freemasonry, druidic practices, witchcraft, Satanism, it's all very.
What do you think like the Harry Potter movies? Are they?
I've heard that she has drawn from some real life witchcraft, but I don't know. I've heard mixed accounts of that. I don't think Harry Potter's like.
So like watching the movies, that's not doing anything wrong.
No, I wouldn't say so. I think it's mostly in good fun, honestly. But when it first came out, you got the certain Christians that were like, oh, "It's the devil," and it's like, well, okay, if you read it, I don't think it's really like. From what I understand, I've heard people that claim that she's drawn from real life witchcraft in some aspects of her book, like some of the things that she put in there to kind of colorize her stories more or less. But I wouldn't worry too much about it. I know Twilight stuff is totally different. That's just nonsense. Like that's not really based in anything. It's just for fun. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. What were you gonna say though? Oh.
I was gonna say something about the Mayans.
The Mayans?
Yeah, they would make these huge reflecting ponds where they would do drugs, sit around and watch the reflection of, which I think is where they got these great cameras.
Maybe.
Just watching.
Yeah.
Recording.
Yeah, well,
stars and moons and sunrise.
Yeah, they were huge into astronomy. It seems like every one of these empires was big into astronomy. The Babylonians, the Persians, like. They were all like paying attention to the sky, and it all had. Yeah, I guess that's more comfortable, right? I guess. Yeah, man, they had some stuff that like a lot of people wonder, like, wait, how did they figure that out? You know what I mean? Like, what in the world was going on there? It's strange. The more you dig into some of this stuff, it's like, whoa. And the fact that they all just got wiped out unexpectedly too, like just totally disappeared from the face of the earth. How does that happen too? I don't know, man. You hear some weird stuff. But all right, let's pray and then we'll call it a night. Lord, thank you again for bringing us together and for your word. And again, Lord, we pray that you would just reveal these things to us in due time and teach us what we should know, Lord. Some of this is confusing stuff and we're doing our best to unravel it, but we ask that you would reveal it to us in the appropriate time and that we know the truth of your word and what it is that we should know from this book. So we lift our lives to you and pray that you would help us to walk according to your word, Lord, and that our lives would be pleasing to you. And we lift this night and the rest of our week to you and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, that's all I got for you guys tonight.